Good evening, everybody. As you join our presentation, we'll allow everybody to come into the room in Zoom for just a few minutes before we get started. So thank you once again for joining us. The Historical Society of Santa Rosa is presenting tonight's webinar that will be on Hidden Valley and the Unknown Cemetery. So we'll just give a couple more minutes for everybody to join us. Thanks again for joining us on your Thursday evening. It's great to have you here. And at the same time, we are broadcasting live simultaneously on Facebook. Folks will be joining us throughout the presentation. And for tonight's presentation, I'll remind you, it's the Historical Society of Santa Rosa's monthly webinar, and tonight we will be going into the Hidden Valley area and the Unknown Cemetery. Before we get started, I wanted to let you know a few things about our webinar tonight. You'll be seeing myself, Leslie Graves, your MC and Zoom host, along with our guest presenter on screen. But we won't see any of our audience because it's more like an auditorium where our participants are in the auditorium, shielded from view, and our presenter, as well as myself, are on stage. We also do have a simultaneous live broadcast on Facebook, and after this presentation, we will be uploading a recorded copy to our YouTube page for the Historical Society of Santa Rosa as well. For questions and answers, that will happen after our presentation. Tonight's presentation is approximately 1 hour long. So right around 7 o'clock, we'll be starting into the Q&A. And in order to ask questions, you will need to key in your questions into the chat box. And then I will be presenting and facilitating the questions to our presenter. If you're on Facebook Live, you can also key in your questions as comments. And one of our administrators on Facebook will be relaying those questions over to us so that I can facilitate those questions here live on Zoom. So with that, I want to introduce you to our guest presenter. You may remember tonight's guest presenter from the first Historical Society of Santa Rosa webinar back in October of last year, when he shared the secrets of Santa Rosa cemeteries with us. Join me in welcoming back local cemetery expert, author, and historian, Jeremy Nichols.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining me tonight. And I'm excited to tell you about the Hidden Valley Cemetery, which most people didn't even know existed. Last year, when I spoke to you on the secrets of Santa Rosa cemeteries, I pretty much covered everything. And when I was asked to speak on cemeteries again, I wasn't sure there was any more to tell. Then in April of this year, I discovered a list of surplus properties that Sonoma County was proposing to sell. And the Hidden Valley Cemetery was one of them. The county thought it was just a vacant lot. I immediately notified 3rd District Supervisor Chris Corsi to say, hey, this is not just some vacant lot, it's actually a cemetery and you need to look into that. The history that I provided to him, you are now going to hear. So for this, we need to go back, for starters, all the way to the year of 1855. In 1855, there was no county cemetery. The state legislature had just passed an act requiring counties to take care of the indigent sick. Now, indigent is a word they used back then. It simply means a person who is supported in part or entirely on public funds. So I suppose every one of us who's on Social Security could call ourselves indigent today. That's just how it is. There was almost no social safety net in the 1800s. Almost everyone worked as long as they were capable of working. If they no longer had a job to support themselves, some of them could go stay with family. But as far as a true retirement, almost no one except the wealthy could retire because they had no income. If you were really down and out, you could go stay with the county. But the county made this as difficult and embarrassing as possible. You simply would not believe what people had to go through. For starters, you had to fill out a petition asking for county support. You had to have the petition signed by 10 good citizens, which basically meant you have to go door to door begging people to sign your petition. You had to have the supervisor of your district approve it, and then have the whole board of supervisors approve it. And because the supervisors is a public body, all of this was published every month in the newspaper. The county maintained what it called an indigent list. And if you were receiving money from the county, you went on the indigent list and your name was in the paper every month. So you had to be really down and out to be willing to tolerate the embarrassment of being on the indigent list. Another option was to stay at a county almshouse or poorhouse, but at 1855, the county didn't have anything like that. So you were really down and out. Now, a couple of years later, the county created the office of county physician. And this person was, at that time, the entire county health department. They did everything, and it was a part-time job. They also had a private practice. And the first county physician was actually a partnership. Dr. Boyce and Dr. Todd together were the county physician. And if you didn't have money to go to a doctor, you could go to them and they would treat you. But you had to go to their office, or they had to come to your home, or you had to stay in a hotel in Santa Rosa so that they could treat you, because there was no county hospital in those days. Now, as far as people who died and didn't have any money or family or friends to take care of their burial, the county would take care of your burial. And in the early years of the county, they went to the trustees of rural cemetery and asked permission to bury people in a corner of rural cemetery. You can see it on the map there marked in red. And the county used that for almost 20 years. And as near as we can tell, I've worked with the people who take care of rural cemetery. We think as many as 200 people may have been buried there. A few years later, in 1859, the first county hospital was built. This is an old picture that you may have seen many times. It's taken from Exchange Avenue, looking north Exchange Bank is in that space right now. You can see the plaza to the right. That was the plaza donated by Mr. Carrillo. And of course, later it had the county courthouse on it. But at this time, it was just a plaza, and sometimes people had their horses graze there. And you can see a bunch of horses parked along Exchange. So the first courthouse is there. And then next to the courthouse was the county jail. And in 1859, they added a second story to the jail and put the first county hospital on top of it, except it really wasn't a hospital. It was more of a first aid station, and it had a couple of beds. If you look closely at that picture, you can see an outside staircase because you didn't want to have to go through the jail to get to the hospital. So it had its own entrance from 4th Street. Now, this arrangement was unpopular with everybody. The people in the jail were quite often drunk and very noisy, which disturbed the people in the hospital. And in those days, everyone was afraid of contagious diseases. Just like we're worried about COVID today, they worried about smallpox and tuberculosis and measles and all sorts of nasty things. And everyone was sure that the hospital was full of nasty diseases that they didn't want to have anything to do with. So the patients in the hospital didn't like the noisy people in the jail, and the prisoners in the jail did not like the sick people in the hospital. And it was a very unpopular location that lasted until 1866, when the county built a real hospital. Here is the first map of Sonoma County, the Bowers map, which came out in 1877, and it shows the hospital. And this was built on property in Green's Addition. You can see that marked on the map. Dr. Green was an early Sonoma County doctor, and in fact, he had served at one time as county physician. So this hospital was built there. They paid $450 for the land and $8,800 for the building, which is an awful lot of money. And it stood to the north of the Presbyterian church that was there for many years. This was a real hospital and was taken care of by the county physician. They hired a person to be the steward of the hospital, and part of the deal there, if you were hired as hospital steward, your wife became the hospital nurse. That and the doctor was the entire staff of the hospital, and it had a capacity of about 20 people. Later, the county moved to another new hospital, and in 1891, this building, the old hospital building, was dragged over to Mendocino. And you can see the building in the black circle there in the photograph. This is an aerial photograph from the 1940s. Just above and to the left of the old hospital building, you can see a big white building. That is the Presbyterian Church at the corner of Humboldt and 7th Street, which back then was called Johnson Street. The church is no longer there, of course, but it was there for many years, and the hospital was next to it until it was moved to Mendocino, where excuse me, it was converted into a rooming house until it was finally torn down in 1953. And Bruner's radio and TV shop went in where that building was, and Bruner's still has that building today. It's still there. at 532 Mendocino. One thing I have never been able to find, and I want you all to look in your photo albums, I cannot find a picture of that county hospital building when it was on Humboldt. There's got to be a picture someplace. I have been through the library's collection and I cannot find a picture. That picture and a picture in the Press Democrat when it was torn down are the only pictures that I have so far. So your task tonight or later on tonight, people, is to go find a picture of that. In January of 1874, the Sonoma County supervisors decided to buy land for a county farm. In many areas, a county farm is a work farm where petty criminals would work off their sentence, or where poor people could go and work for a living. But this was neither of those things. The county had in mind running it as a farm to grow crops, because since the county had a hospital, they had to feed the patients in the hospital. Having your own farm makes it easier to come up with that food without spending a lot of money. They had the care of the poor people who couldn't afford their own home, and they were staying with the county. They had been staying in the county hospital, taking up hospital beds that were actually needed for patients. With a county farm, they could move those people out there and have an almshouse for them. They also needed their own cemetery. They had been using rural cemetery for almost 20 years, and that was about to blow up on them. I'll tell you about that in a moment. They also wanted to grow crops that they could sell, primarily wine grapes and hay, because that would bring in a little money to help support the farm. So, and lastly, they wanted to move the county hospital from Humboldt Street. When in 1866, when the hospital was built, it was considered to be in the outer suburbs of Santa Rosa. A few years later, it was surrounded by homes and businesses, and it's still full of sick people with contagious diseases. People were still scared of the contagious disease menace, and so they said, get this thing and its sick people out of town, put them someplace out in the country. And that is exactly what the county did. This property, which is on today's Shenate Road, was in fact 2 miles out of town, out in the middle of nowhere. The county did its research, and in 1874, they contracted with Lewis A. Murdoch. You may have heard of the Lewis School. You may have heard of Murdoch Terrace. These are all named after him. And he sold the county 100 acres, the area outlined in red on that map, for $5,000. That's all the county paid for that land. Now, $5,000 was a lot of money, but as you know, the county is thinking about selling it today for millions. Their investment up front was $5,000, that's all. So the contract was signed in 1874, and they actually made payments. The last payment wasn't made until late 1875 and title transferred in 1876, but they had permission to use the property starting at the end of 1874, because what happened in May of 1874 was the trustees of Rural Cemetery had been patient, had been nice guys. They were letting the county use their property for free. Okay, the county did not give them penny one. And by 1874, they had buried, we estimate, as many as 200 people there. Normally, you know, the trustees had been selling individual cemetery plots for $10 a piece. So this meant the county was occupying $2,000 worth of their property for nothing. And I suspect when the county started out 20 years earlier, the rural cemetery people probably just thought it was going to be onesie twosies, and now suddenly they're up to 200. So in May of 1874, the trustees made an appearance before the County Board of Supervisors demanding money if the county were going to continue using their cemetery. The supervisors got up on their hind legs and said, hell no, we won't pay. And while they were at it, they said, all future burials will be in the southeast corner of the property known as the county farm. And you can see that in the map. See the red star? That is the southeast corner. It doesn't really look like a southeast corner, but that is where it was. Now, at this time, the county was burying about 10 people a year. And I should point out that the county didn't really do the burials themselves. I mean, the supervisors were not out there with a shovel, okay? Every year they put out to bid, it was listed in the newspaper, the contract to handle county burials. And one of the local morticians or another would get that contract, and they would bury the dead for the county, wherever the county wanted, for the next year. And in this era, it was usually $10 to $12 a burial. And for that, they had to supply a coffin and clothes for the deceased, and they had to take them up and dig the grave and plant them. So that's actually a fair amount of work for $10 or $12 even back then. So as near as I can tell, in the 3 years that that cemetery was used, they probably buried 2 or 3 dozen people. Now, another important thing happened in March of 1877. The city of Santa Rosa voted in council to build a pest house on the grounds of the county farm. Now, a pest house is not where you send your little brother when he's a pest. Pest in context is short for pestilence. This is a leper colony. It is where you had to go and stay if they found out that you had a contagious disease and you could not isolate yourself at home. Remember, a lot of people were living in rooming houses or hotels or on the street in a tent or what have you, and they didn't have a home with a family to take care of them while they hunkered down with their smallpox or what have you. They had to go stay in the pest house. It's interesting that I can find no evidence in the county supervisor's minutes that the county actually approved of the city building a pest house on their property. But it happened, and obviously it was approved. They certainly didn't hide it. In fact, one of the things that happened was the county supervisors started a new cemetery next to the pest house. And it turns out that people were not only afraid of contagious diseases and the people who carried them, they were afraid of the dead bodies themselves. Modern medical science says that in almost all cases, when the person dies, when the host dies, the disease dies. But in 1877, they didn't know that. So the rule was get the dead person into the ground as quickly as possible. And the easiest way to do that was to have a cemetery right next to the pest house. So there you were, coughing your life away, and next to you is a cemetery that has had to do wonders for your self-esteem, but that's how it was back in the 1800s. So the cemetery in the southeast corner was used for only 3 years, and then they simply walked away from it. Now, we know for sure that the cemetery was there next to the pest house because the neighbor complained about it. In 1878, a man by the name of James Warner, you can see his property there marked in green on the map next to the county farm marked in red, and the little symbol there that I added shows where the cemetery and the pest house was. So Warner wanted to build a house marked X there, and apparently he did not want to be next to a cemetery. So he went to the supervisors with some cock and bull story about the employees not burying people deep enough or something like that. And the employees stood up for themselves, and the county ended up saying to Warner, go away, that's a load of crap. The nice thing is that the whole thing got in the supervisor's minutes and it got in the newspaper. So we're absolutely sure that by March of 1878, the cemetery was where I have marked it, and the old one had been abandoned. Now, the pest house, in fact, did not get a lot of use. And it was actually several years before I was able to find in the Sonoma Democrat a short note that several people with mild cases of smallpox had been removed to the Pest House. So it was used for a number of years. Things like this rarely get a lot of publicity. We may be very proud of our willingness to take care of people who no longer have the ability to take care of themselves, but it's not the sort of thing that the county or the city will brag about in their advertising. Come to Sonoma County and see our wonderful pest house. No, you don't talk about that. It doesn't get in the records. It doesn't get in the paper. So in fact, we don't know how long the pest house was there. Obviously, it's gone today. So Mr. Warner had to build his house and not worry about it anyway. Now, I would add, going back to Rural Cemetery again, in 1884, the trustees of Rural Cemetery asked permission to move the roughly 200 burials from where they had been to a corner of the cemetery, because again, there were 200 cemetery plots that had been used, and they felt, you know, this is $2,000 worth of real estate that we'd like to be able to sell. So they asked the supervisors for permission to move them, and the supervisors said, as long as it was done humanely and at no cost to the county, go right ahead. So they did. They dug them up and moved them and put these plots up for sale. The ironic thing is that nobody bought them. Apparently, people did not want to put grandma in a used grave, much less one that had been occupied by a pauper or a criminal or a formerly sick person or what have you. So in fact, even today, only a few of those graves are occupied. And even though Rural Cemetery is essentially closed to new burials, that area is still unused today. Now we're going to fast forward all the way to 1966. And for reasons that I have not yet found, the county decided to sell off the easternmost strip of land that was part of the county farm to a developer. And here you can see it marked in red. And that was sold in 1966. I don't know yet how much they got, probably more than they paid for the whole county farm in 1874. Interestingly enough, they knew about the original cemetery in 1966, even though it hadn't been used since 1877. Somehow they knew that was there, and it's marked on the map, not part of subdivision. And that is still a vacant lot today. If you were to drive south on Hidden Valley from Chenate Road, you would eventually come to a vacant lot, and that is still owned by the county and still has 2 or 3 dozen burials in it. So fast forward to April of 2021, and this property shows up on a list of properties that the county would like to sell. And that appeared in a county document, which I saw. And I immediately recognized this. I knew that there's only one vacant lot on Hidden Valley, and that's the one you're looking at there, and that had to be the old cemetery. So I immediately sent an email to 3rd District Supervisor Chris Corsi, and I said, I have no problem with selling that lot and putting a house or two on it, but you need to understand that that was the original county cemetery, and anybody developing that property would have to remove each and every burial if they can find them. It would be quite a job. So Chris wrote back to me, and basically he said, what documentation do you have? And I shared with him the history that you have just heard. And I told him everything that I knew about the property, including the fact that this strip of land had been sold in 1866, and somehow the county knew in 1866 that it was a cemetery, but by 2021, they had forgotten. So the county, Chris turned this over to his staff, and they dug in, did their own research, confirmed all my historical information, and then they had the dog teams out. Now, you may know that there are specialized dogs that can detect human remains that are hundreds of years old. They tell me that when the bones of a person buried in the ground decompose, this creates a chemical scent that the dog can detect with their sensitive nose. And the dogs are trained, when they smell this smell, they lie down. And the handlers of the dogs will have each dog go one at a time and check out the whole property. And every place the dog lies down, they put a flag in the ground. Then that dog is taken away, and a second dog is brought out, and it does the same thing. And everywhere that dog smells something and lies down, they put in a flag. And after this has been done 3 or 4 times, they have a whole collection of flags. And the county did this, and I am looking forward to seeing the report, which the county has. This property is a little over 1/3 of an acre. You can see how long it is along Hidden Valley there. And you could probably put 2 houses or a duplex or something like that. And it would be an ideal infill project, but you have to worry about the burials. So this went along until just this past Tuesday, when I got an email from Supervisor Corsi, and he said, Jeremy, just wanted to let you know that investigation has determined a high likelihood of remains on the Hidden Valley site, and we will not be offering it for sale as surplus property, unquote. And the other thing he's going to try to do is figure out how to mark the records so that, as he says, we don't have to go through this dance every 15 or 20 years into perpetuity. So that takes care of that. For now, the cemetery is safe. It will not be developed, thanks to the records from the library and the Sonoma County Archives. And I want to thank the Historical Society of Santa Rosa for inviting me to speak today. I want to thank the librarians at the local history and genealogy library for helping me access the archives and dragging in the old records and the supervisor's minutes for me to go through. I also want to thank Diva Proto, the county recorder, who helped me find some of the deeds that I needed to identify the sale and purchase of this property. And finally, I want to thank Supervisor Chris Corsi of the 3rd District for being so cooperative and accepting of my contention and going through the research and getting it confirmed that it is very definitely a cemetery and not to be sold. So thank you very much. I invite your questions.
Thank you, Jeremy. That's such great information and really brought us through the history of even how this happened and how the cemetery came to be. I feel like this should be watched by so many people. I want to make sure that our city council watches it. I'm sure Chris Corsi is going to be watching this. And again, everybody, just so you know, if you do want to pass this on, it will be recorded. It is being recorded right now, and it will be uploaded onto YouTube. So you can go to the Historical Society of Santa Rosa's YouTube page, and you can find a recording of this program and all of the webinars that the Historical Society has produced over this past about 8 months or so, maybe a little bit more. So do have some questions here. Thanks everybody for, again, joining us this evening for the Hidden Secret or Hidden Valley and the Unknown Cemetery. And our first question comes from Ellen Bowen. Thanks for joining us. And Jeremy, she asks, do you or anyone have information as to the recorded names of the people that were buried in this cemetery, in the Hidden Valley Cemetery?
That's a really good question, Ellen. Thank you for asking. And basically the answer is no. In the early years, there were no formal death certificates anywhere in California. The people who handled the burials, the funeral homes, the morticians may have had their own records, but they probably don't exist any longer. If the county kept records, they don't seem to exist any longer. I have been going through the newspapers. Sometimes people were mentioned in the newspaper, whether they were rich or poor, when they died and were buried. Unfortunately, that far back, there just were very few, and the newspaper didn't often say where people were buried. And even if they did, if they were buried by the county, they often didn't want to embarrass them by saying that they were buried in the Paupers Cemetery, that they were buried in Potter's Field, if you will. So they just said they were buried by the county. And unfortunately, that doesn't necessarily mean that they were buried in Hidden Valley. For example, if you were a good Catholic, you could be buried in Calvary Cemetery and the county would still take care of it. That is little known, but it did happen. Sometimes somebody popped up at the last minute and said, oh, he used to work for my dad. I'll take care of it, and we can bury him in rural cemetery or something like that. So unfortunately, we probably will never know. I'm working on putting together a list of possible people who might be there, but I don't think I will ever be sure.
Well, if anybody can get that information together, it's you, Jeremy. So such a treasure that you are for all of us here in Sonoma County, Santa Rosa. And Karen Stone agrees with that. She says that you deserve an award for helping to protect the site from sale and development. And yeah, great that you were able to see that notice. Obviously, you keep your eyes open for those kinds of things about the potential sale of that property. And we all thank you for that. As well as Debbie Williams, she also says that it was wonderful information, so informative. So thank you so much for sharing all of it. We do have a comment from Facebook, and I want to take this moment right now for all of our participants here on Zoom as well as on Facebook, that if you do have a question on Zoom, just key it into our chat box. I'm unable to get to those raised hands. The webinar format, I will not be calling on any raised hands, but you can go ahead and key your questions into the chat. And if you're on Facebook and you're joining us with that live simultaneously broadcast presentation on Facebook, go ahead and put your question in the comments, and then our admin on Facebook will relay those questions to us here. Like the one from Caitlin, she actually said that this was fascinating. She'd always heard different stories about who was buried there, and now we know. So good work. We might not know the specifics, but we do know that that is a cemetery, that there are remains of people from that time period buried in that plot, and to think of it as somewhat sacred ground. So it's nice to know when you're walking or running or even biking or driving down Hidden Valley, as you look up that hill and you can say, oh, I remember what Jeremy was telling us all about. Karen also says, per an old Gala barren column, there were a few markers or headstones as of the late 1960s. Had you heard that, Jeremy?
No, I had not, and I would love to see that Gala Barron column if Karen has a copy to share with me, and if not, I will track Gala Barron down and see if I can get it from her. Yeah. Thank you, that's great.
And hopefully that's not getting confused with the old hospital site that you were talking about, that is off of Sinead, right? You talked
Correct.
About that in your previous presentation here with the Historical Society of Santa Rosa. You talked about the secrets of the cemeteries in Santa Rosa, and how was that the one off of Sinead? That was the one that kind of got you started, correct? As
yes,
far as finding out information.
That's the well, it's not new. That's the one that they built next to the Pest House. Mm-hmm. That's the one that today is called the Sinead Historic Cemetery. And so if you think about it, the county has actually had quite a few cemeteries. They've got the original part of Rural Cemetery. They've got Hidden Valley. They've got the Sinead Historic Cemetery. And then finally, the current county cemetery is 3 acres behind and really part of Rural Cemetery.
Yeah, and thanks to you, we've got a bunch of information on that. And the great thing, thanks also to the Historical Society of Santa Rosa, because this is a great format to share this information. We are actually making an oral history right now by recording this and having this on YouTube. So it's great to be able to look back on this. Even, if you have just a question about what Jeremy said, at a later time, you can look back at that recording. So here from Denise Hill, she actually mentions that a monument or signage might be nice. Maybe not so desirable for neighbors or real estate agents in that area on Hidden Valley, but it would be nice to have just something of a marker, right, to identify that space.
Yeah, I have thought about that, and I'm going to talk to Supervisor Corsi. There's certainly no point in rubbing it in people's faces that it was a pauper cemetery, but you could have a simple plaque that said County Cemetery 1874 to 1877 or something around that, because I know that I've spoken to the neighbors on Hidden Valley and they really don't know what it is. Some people think it might be an old Indian burial ground, which I doubt, but nobody really knows what it is. And certainly we would want to clear it with the neighbors before we did anything. And we could raise some money to put a plaque up there so it wouldn't cost the county anything. So we'll see. There may be objections, but we can certainly try.
Yeah, that would be a nice thing. I think the neighborhood actually might welcome something like that, as far as, you know, answer some of those questions. I'll put that out there anyway. And we also have a question about maybe publishing this. I talked about now this recording will be on YouTube. I know that you've authored some books and some papers and whatnot. Do you have other things coming out that you're publishing at this time and writing?
This will be a chapter in my history of the Sonoma County Hospital, which I'm working on currently. So yes, it will be published.
That's great. And that leads us right into Ray's question. Ray wanted you to know from Facebook that this was a great, really nice presentation. And then he also talked about revisiting that hospital on Humboldt. There was the Santa Rosa Hospital on Humboldt across from the high school that is pictured in the library. Is that not the same one that you're mentioning on Mendocino?
That is not the same hospital.
All righty.
This was a county hospital, not a city hospital. Got
it. So Ray, you're not out of that homework that Jeremy was mentioning earlier, and he assigned to everybody was to go and search through their photos, get out the old family albums and see if we can find a picture of the hospital, the county hospital. That was, I believe, if I remember this correctly, Humboldt and 7th. That's what you said, Jeremy, right?
Yes, between 7th and Cherry.
Got it. And then we have a question or some information from Douglas Williams here. It says, thank you for the 1866 map. It was actually the first time that he has seen the property of my great-great-grandfather, J.M. Williams, delineated. So, wow, that's great. Douglas, that's pretty awesome just to be watching this presentation and see that. So, and Jeremy, where did you find those maps that you shared with us tonight?
The library, the local history and genealogy library has those. The 1867 Bowers map is very rare. There are only 1 or 2 nice copies in existence, and the library has one of them. And you can make arrangements to go to the local history and genealogy library at 3rd and E in Santa Rosa, and you can see a copy. That's great.
That's great. Thanks for that information. Jeff on Facebook wanted you to know that it was just great research. Definitely. Jeremy always brings so much information to these presentations. It's always great to have Jeremy here. Kay Ward says that she believes some people have been buried in the old rural cemetery in the last 30 years. How did they qualify? And thank you in advance for your answer on that one.
That and she is correct. Rural cemetery has 2 or 3 burials every year, and they qualify because their family already owned a plot in the cemetery. That there are no new families allowed to be buried there, but if your family already owns a plot, you can qualify to be buried there.
I do remember you mentioning that in your past presentation as well. So it's a family connection. And then Nancy on Facebook, she wanted you to know that this was part of the dairy before the development.
That makes sense. The county had I wouldn't call it a dairy, but they did have some cows, and the milk and the butter that was churned from it was used for feeding 3 groups of people that the county was responsible for. The old people in the almshouse, the patients in the county hospital, and the prisoners in the county jail were fed as much as they could on products grown at the county farm, including dairy cows, pigs and chicken and occasional sheep, and vegetables. They grew a lot of their own vegetables, and this is documented in reports of the county physician. The county physician was not only in charge of the hospital, he was ultimately in charge of the farm, even though they hired a farmer to actually run the farm. Nonetheless, the farmer reported ultimately to the county physician. And so when the physician did his annual reports, he included the value of the products that they used, and all the details of how much they spent to run the farm. It's interesting, they went through hundreds of cords of wood every year because everything was wood fired. All the heating stoves, all the cook stoves were wood fired. And the county was paying about $4.50 a cord for wood that was typically cut 4 feet long. And the people living in the county almshouse, the old people who were no longer able to work, were nonetheless required to cut and split their own wood for the stove in their little building. That just was expected. That was a chore that they had to do. So that there's an enormous amount of detail that was in the report from the county physician, and it's all in the archives.
Which are on our county. So our county archives right now are temporarily closed down, correct?
They're in the process of being moved, and they will be available again in October.
Great, yeah. I knew you would know that information. So they're being moved out of their space right now into, I believe, an undisclosed space in Santa Rosa as we know it, that's to make them safer, correct?
That's correct. The new location is over by the airport.
Okay.
And that is also a temporary location. It's moved there because it is safe from the fires that have put it at risk in the past. they hope eventually to move the archives downtown. And as you know, the county is talking about moving their offices downtown, and we don't know what exactly will happen and when, but one of the possibilities is when they build new offices, they might make room for the archives, which would make them a lot closer, a lot more convenient for everybody. But in the meantime, they will be available again in October, and you access them not by going to that building near the airport. You access them by going to the History and Genealogy Library at Third and E and telling the librarians what volume or what box or what have you want to see, and they bring it in for you.
Oh, wow. That is just such great information to know. Thanks for sharing that information with everybody as well. So truly the Historic and Genealogy Library there, downtown Santa Rosa, is the place to go for a lot of this research. And great folks too, they help out a lot when you go and you ask questions. So folks that might be wanting to start some kind of research, follow up on what Jeremy said, look for those maps and whatnot, you know, go and check out there and get yourself onto their newsletter so that you can see all of their updated information and when those archives will be available in October. Here we've got that information, a little follow-up information from Karen Stone. She was the one that mentioned the Gala Barron columns about potential headstones on this property in a 1966. And she says the two Gala Barron columns are on newspapers.com, and one being November 17th, 1982, and the other one being November 23rd, 1982. So, and
That's
Jeremy,
great. Thank you.
yeah. We'll get you this information from the chat too. So make sure that you have that. And here's a question from Nancy on Facebook. Have you researched the cemetery on Sinead? But she's specifically talking about the cemetery on Sinead where they straightened the road.
I think that she means the Sinead Historic Cemetery. And yes, my book on that was published in 2009, and it's available on Amazon, and it's called Potter's Field, the Sinead Historic Cemetery in Santa Rosa, California.
And so I'm typing that in right now. Potter's Field, the Sinead Historic Cemetery
in Santa Rosa, California.
And that was in 2009.
Correct.
There you go, folks. So just in case you need that information, you can copy and paste it somewhere just from that. And remember, again, I can't say this enough, that all of this information, of course, will be available to you because it is all being recorded right now. The complete presentation and all of the presentations, each monthly webinar is available to you on the YouTube channel for the Historical Society of Santa Rosa. And so without any other questions there, Jeremy, I'm going to go ahead and go on to our next screen right there, because as I talk about our monthly webinars, our next one coming up is on Thursday, September 16th, once again on Zoom, as well as live simultaneously on Facebook starting at 6 p.m. And it's the making of the revised and expanded Santa Rosa Rural Cemetery book with Sandy Frey, and I do not know how to pronounce her last name. I bet you do, Jeremy, and Raymond Owen. So that is going to be great. I heard that they just compiled tons of information, took years to make this revised and expanded Santa Rosa Rural Cemetery book.
Yeah, it's a fantastic book. Sandy Frary
Thank you.
is a retired civilian employee of the Sonoma County Sheriff, and she worked closely with the Sonoma County Coroner to find all sorts of records. And Ray is a retired federal investigator. He can find out anything. He is a really good person to have as a friend. He would be a dangerous person to have as an enemy, because you couldn't hide anything from those two.
So watch
they made an ideal team, and it makes me tired just to look at their book. There's so much work going into that. Wonderful, wonderful book. This is going to be a fantastic presentation. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, myself as well. It's a great compliment right there, Jeremy, for both of them. And just lots of praise for getting that book out after so much research and so many years putting it together. Looking forward to this again, Thursday, September 16th. That's the third Thursday of the month, starting at 6 p.m. And that link in order to register for the Zoom will be on the Historical Society of Santa Rosa's webpage, which is at www.historicalsocietysantarosa. It's actually .org, but I bet it will send you there if you put .com as well. So, and you can find out information about becoming a member of the Historical Society, finding out about their newsletter, great information in the newsletter. So do go to the Historical Society, santarosa.org, and find out more information, become a member, and you never know, you might get hooked onto this kind of research and find yourself on one of these webinars. Maybe by next year we'll actually be in person, so you might find yourself in one of those too. But we do have more webinars coming up throughout the year, so always go to the Historical Society of Santa Rosa's webpage for more information. And Jeremy, do you have any more information to share with us this evening?
I'll let you know that I found the Gala Baron column, and that's great. It's something I didn't previously have, so thank you very much for that. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Karen. That was great. It was Karen Stone, I believe, that was sharing that information. And also, Jeremy, you talked about coming out with another book. Do you have any timeline on that? No pressure? No additional pressure there?
No, the problem with books, as Sandy and Ray will tell us next month, is they keep growing. And like a work of art, which my book certainly is not, they say no work of art is ever finished, only abandoned. Oh. And I suspect that's what's going to happen to my book. Well, there's a lot of history to tell, and I'm just trying to organize it and keep it from being too big.
Well, I can imagine there's lots of stones for you to, turn over and find more information under. So thank you for doing all of that research and all of that work, and for always sharing so much information with us here. Again, I encourage everybody to go back and look at those past webinars. You can find Jeremy's online at the Historical Society of Santa Rosa's YouTube page, and that was The Secrets of Cemeteries in Santa Rosa. So check that out. It was from October of 2020. So thanks again, everybody, for joining us. Thank you for joining us here on YouTube. And thank you those that also joined us on Facebook Live. And remember, that's always going to be an option, and you can check it out on Facebook Live, and that recording will be there as well. So I want to make sure that you all know to, again, go to the Historical Society of Santa Rosa's website and become a member, and make a little donation while you're at it if you've enjoyed these webinars. And we thank you so much for that. without any further ado, I think we're going to let you all go and let Jeremy go and enjoy the rest of his evening. Thank you again, sir, for being here, sharing all of this great information and all of this great history.
You're very welcome. Thank you for the opportunity.
All right, everybody. We hope that you have a great evening. Stay safe out there, and remember to resource the Historical Society of Santa Rosa when you want to find out some more history right here in our own hometown. All right, everybody. Have a great evening. Good night.